Steve Steinberg, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversations.
Thanks, Ron. Glad to be here.
Well, this is a long time coming because you are very prolific. The first question, I should start off by saying we're going to be talking about your book about Mike Donlin, a rough and rowdy life from New York baseball to idol to stage and screen. Pardon me for screwing up the title there, but he is a fascinating character in the period shortly before Babe Ruth comes on the scene. Of course, everybody, baseball fan and non-baseball fan alike, has heard of Babe Ruth. But Mike Donlin in his day was, as to his fame, Babe Ruth of his time, it seems.
Yeah, on the back of our book, we got our publisher to agree to put a blurb there by someone who died 80 years or 90 years before our book came out, and that was Damon Runyon. And in the mid 1920s, Runyon said that Babe Ruth may hit more home runs, but there was no one that created more excitement, more colorful walking up to the plate than Mike Donlin. So that gives you a little indication there.
So talk a little bit more about Mike Donlin and why he was so popular.
Well, he was an early bad boy of baseball because he was a second generation, well, first generation American born Irishman. He had a drinking problem, and he even missed a good part of one season being in prison for attacking someone. And but he had prolific power for the dead ball era and hit for a very, very high batting average. I think Lyle and I, with all of our research, we were actually surprised at just how good a ball player he really was. And it because of the fact that for different reasons he didn't play a full career, partly because in the main part because he fell in love with one of the most famous actresses in America, and he just left the game and walked away from it to be with her. And so but the 5 seasons that he played pretty regularly, he was always second or third in the batting title and right up there in even the modern stats like OPS.
He's one of these players that you look at them and you think, wow, this could have been a Hall of Famer had he stayed on the straight and narrow, had he had the longevity that he missed because of various reasons. Uh, how many teams did he play for?
Well, he played for a few of them. He started out with the Cardinals and then went on to the Baltimore Orioles in the first year of the American League, went on to the Reds, and he wore out his welcome in more than one place. And John McGraw gave him another chance. But then near the end of his career, he ended up playing for both the Boston Braves and the Pirates. But really, his claim for fame, he was the leading hitter on the team in '04 when they won the pennant. There was no World Series that year and the star of the 1905 team, as well as 1908 that fell just short in the famous season of the Merkle game.
So, as you note, he was also famous off the field for his acting, singing. How did he get involved in that?
Well, he fell in love with Mabel Height, and her career and her life ended tragically very young, so she's probably less well known than he is. But they married in 1906, and in 1907 he just took off, and this is before he joined her on the stage. He basically took off because he wanted to be with her. But after the 1908 season, ball players were going on the stage, although a lot of them, including Ty Cobb and John McGraw, said it created panic attacks and then they couldn't handle it.
Hmm.
And Mabel taught him the ropes, and he joined her. And we have different indications that when they opened at on Broadway after the 1908 season, it was the biggest ovation that anybody had ever heard. Will Rogers weaves in and out of our book, and Will Rogers said that ovation, that opening night at Hammerstein's Theater, was unlike anything that he heard in his decades of performing.
One of the things I enjoy about reading books of this era is you mentioned Damon Runyon before. The writers of that era, because there was no television, obviously, there was not even really radio yet. So the written word was the only way to express what was going on. And some of these writers are so flowery
Right,
and poetic in their
right.
writings. Uh, I also noticed, and the name escapes me at the moment, there was one, was it Villa? Who seemed to be pretty much anti uh, Donlin. And he strikes me as representing, whenever you have a baseball novel and movie, there always seems to be a newspaper man like Max Mercy in The Natural, who seems to have it out for the player for whatever reason.
Well, Villa's an interesting guy because I think he goes back to the late 1880s. He supposedly introduced the typewriter at ringside. He would come to boxing title fights in the 1890s carrying his typewriter. And in 1921, and we talk about it in Lyle Spatz, who's my co-author here in our first book, how Villa didn't care for Ruth when Ruth was rising to stardom either. And yeah, sort of a curmudgeon and questioning things and yeah, that was the role. But he was really the senior writer. He and Sam Crane, I suppose, a former ball player, were the senior writers in the New York press.
Which there was a lot of New York press in the day. There are multiple newspapers, all competing for uh, sports coverage as almost more than the news, because if I remember correctly, sports was what really went to sell the papers.
It's funny. We love the Dead Ball era because there were so many newspapers, and in the early 1920s, they started to consolidate. And I don't think people realized that, like the New York World, which was a paper, had the Evening World, and the New York Sun had the Evening Sun. These were not evening editions of the morning paper. They were totally separate newspapers. Joe Villa started out in the Evening Sun when I think Dan Daniel was still doing the main column in the Morning Sun.
There's so much I want to get to in the limited time we have. You've written several books that encompass this era, like the early 1900s to the 1920s. What's so special about that for you? Why that must be a challenge when it comes to doing, well, I guess it's easier now to do the research than it was even when you first started.
Yeah, I mean, the era has always captivated me in it's far enough in the past, and yet I'm very much into baseball photographs, and I've never been able to cross into the 19th century because there's so few photographs, and the ones that do exist from that time were more cabinet photos, rigid photos, portraits, and it's just a very evocative era, and the photographs, add a lot to that, and for all of our books, and I've got a lot of connections with collectors of vast and rare collection of photographs, we try to put very special images that haven't been seen for 100 years in our books. So it's a very special time, and we write about these men, as I like to use the phrase that Larry Ritter came up with in his book, in the glory of their times.
One book that I won't say surprised me. I was not familiar with these two gentlemen. Comeback pitchers, the remarkable careers of Howard Emke and Jack Quinn. Now, these are not names that roll off the tongue of your average baseball fan. How do you pick your topics? Like even Mike Donlin, as good as he was, is not a name that comes to mind immediately when you talk about the baseball greats.
Yeah, when we're doing research, we stumble upon things and we sort of tuck it in the back of our minds. And sometimes we go back and it ends up being a rabbit hole. There isn't much of a story there. A lot of times they do sort of dead end. And Howard Emke and Jack Quinn was not one of our best-selling book because they are more obscure and they don't have the strong New York connection. And the New York connection does seem to to help in marketing baseball books, the New York audience. But so many of these people had fascinating stories. And the really ironic thing about them is that, we're discovering all this neat stuff, but the fact remains that every 10-year-old boy in America knew all these things and probably more than we even have been able to find. But, there's only so much that can be remembered. And, they just sort of get, fallen away by the wayside. And
Now,
they deserve to be brought back.
you talk about remembering, and that memory has always been a fascinating thing for me. When you have people you talk with years later, how much can you trust their memory? A lot of these things are first person, they're not written down anywhere else. How reliable is that? And does it make a big difference in your writing?
It's not reliable. And of course, the retro sheet, which is a massive database that Sabre has undertaken, has sometimes contradicted some very famous people's recollections about a pitcher saying, "Oh, he had great success with Ted Williams or Mickey Mantle or someone," and then the numbers don't show that. The recollections are precious because they are memories, as you say, and they have to be they can be presented, but in terms of factual sometimes, and even the famous baseball historian Fred Lieb, he wrote a very famous book when he was, I think, in his 80s. Baseball as I have known it, and and memories do fade. Mine's beginning to fade, and so there's a balance there, I suppose.
I want to talk about your collaboration with Lyle Spatz. I mean, I don't know how you built that relationship, but the first thing I thought of was Gilbert and Sullivan because you've collaborated on
Mm.
several books. Explain how you divide the labor. Who does the writing? Do you both do the writing? I mean, how does this
Yeah,
process?
Lyle and I now, our first book came out in 2010, but we started talking about it in '04 or '05. So we've been doing this for about 20 years now. He's been writing and researching for half a century. I've only been doing it for about a quarter century. We basically, somebody has to write the first chapter. There's no the first draft of a chapter. And in the case of like 1921, we had the Giants and the Yankees. So we arbitrarily, I mean, I would take the first draft of the Yankee chapters, Lyle, the Giant chapters. In this book, we had to just sort of divide it up, arbitrarily. I did more of the vaudeville work, and I think the fact that we really wanted to get our hands around vaudeville almost added an extra year in the research of this book rather than just casually going to Wikipedia and seeing what vaudeville's about. I probably read thousands of pages of stuff on vaudeville. But basically, one of us will do the first draft and send it to the other author, and then we go back and forth, probably an average of 3 times. We each have a revision. And then finally, we finalize it. We then send it on to some readers, which are our colleagues, and they give us feedback. And then we do a round two. And here again, we go back and forth. And then finally, after that's done, we send it to our fact checker. We've got a great fact checker, Gabriel Schechter, who wrote a Victory Faust book. And then the end product comes out. So there's give and take, like in any relationship. We have a rule that if there's absolutely a conflict between the two of us, the person that wrote the first draft is the one that gets the final word. And
Hmm.
I can tell you if we have time later, well, I can only think of really one instance of that. But we usually, because of the mutual respect we have, there's give and take, and we defer to each other's input, and it's a real good team. Lyle is very much of he polishes my writing tremendously and helps make me a better writer. And I poke around more with different newspapers than the average guy, and so we have a lot to draw on here.
Am I correct? You live in different parts of the country?
We live about as far away other than Alaska. I'm in Seattle and he's in Boynton Beach, Florida. So yeah, we send
Wow.
drafts. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a funny story. Last night, after midnight my time in Seattle, which is 3 a.m., I sent him a draft of a chapter. We're working on another book now. And I wake up this morning. I'm not a real early riser. I go to bed late. And he already had sent me back his revised three of this chapter. And now and as he said, here's his last. By the time we get to a revised three, we're taking one last look, and then we say, hey, let's make it go final, at least for that round of the editing. And yeah, so it's all done that way. Obviously, we get on the phone every now and then, and of course, we've met at the Saber Convention, and that's where we started because I said, I'm going to do a book on the 1921 Yankees, maybe, but then Lyle was thinking about it also. That was the Yankees' first pennant, and then we realized there was a terrific pennant race. And there was a bigger story there, which was Ruth coming to New York and really the Yankees seizing popularity from McGraw's Giants. And so we decided to do it together. And that was our fourth book, the Donlin book.
Mhm. Uh, with the like you mentioned, New York is a big, like the big. It probably has more books written about teams based in New York than and all the others combined, probably. Uh, what goes into deciding what you want to write about? I mean, what's the pre-decision process like?
Well, it has to be something that resonates with both of us. And it really has to be somebody that really had an exceptional life. And you talk about memories. I love to play on the word cover. We tend to discover people, but they've really already been discovered decades ago. So we sort of recover them,
Huh.
we uncover them, and we bring them back. I like to use the analogy, their star is still out there in the sky, but there's just so many new and brighter stars that have come along, you can't see them. They haven't fallen out of the sky. They're still there and they deserve to be remembered. And when they are even better than we realize. And we're dead ball era guys. We say, wow, we really have something here. And then when you layer on this tragic love story to it, it really makes it a pretty compelling story. I always tell people that I know that aren't into baseball the way you and I are, that if they were going to read one of our books, this would be the one because there's a lot of non-baseball and it is a shorter book. We're all beginning to feel the dramatic increases in paper prices. And so the day of the 500 or 600 page book, like our early ones, is not going to be anymore.
It's very interesting you mentioned that because in this week's New York Times Magazine, there was an article about biographies, and while everything else is shrinking, I think they say the average book, the average nonfiction, oh, for fiction and nonfiction is 50 pages shorter than it used to be regularly. I didn't think about the cost of producing the book. I think they're thinking, and I was thinking more of the attention span of the reader.
Yeah, the attention span's true, but I was finally, it was finally explained to me by a publishing person why the cost of paper has gone up so much. And I love to ask people the question, and no one's ever gotten the answer. And I give them a hint it has to do with COVID. But basically, in a nutshell, people started ordering things online, and the demand for cardboard, which is boxes, and even now that COVID's over, we're all ordering things online. The demand for cardboard, which competes with paper for pulp has just gone through the roof. And that's unless you're really, really famous, you probably, David Moranis did write a 700-page biography of Jim Thorpe.
Mhm.
And one writer that I know said, well, David can be David because, he's that, well known and he can get away with it. But we're not going to write a 700-page book, let alone a 500-page book anymore. And it actually hones our writing in. We had to cut
Yeah.
a lot of words out of this book. But, when we were done, I think it makes for a better read.
Offhand, do you know, since you mentioned that, first draft, how many words? Did you keep track?
Including the endnotes, I think our books have had around 150 to 160,000 words.
Hmm.
And our publisher usually did not put that much of a emphasis on the endnotes, and we'd pack a lot of stuff in the endnotes. So we had to bring it down to below 120. And I think right now the sweet spot for most publishers, including endnotes, not including index, is about 100,000 words, if not less. So in
Wow.
other words, a 200 to a 300-page book, 70 to 100,000 words.
Yeah, that's what I figured about 80,000 words. So, what do you like to do when you're not doing all this research and writing?
Well, I do a lot of travel. I have a lot of friends in Vietnam. I'm actually heading back there tomorrow. It's a fascinating country, and I've uh, got some very good friends over there studying the language, which is quite an undertaking for a tonal language. I've been doing it for 5 years, but yeah, that's that, and and family and friends. I mean, as we get older, as I get older, I mean, time becomes the most precious commodity. But
Sure.
there's still a real joy in doing the research and going to do the microfilm, which some people think is the most horrendously boring thing. But that's where a lot of the ideas for books come in because you just delve into the microfilm, you're like stepping into a time machine. And even though, as you mentioned, it's a lot easier to do research nowadays because a lot of papers have been digitized,
Mm.
many have not. And I still believe in just going to the New York Public Library and getting, you take people, I mentioned the Pulitzer papers, they haven't been digitized. There are just different newspapers out there, and each newspaper back in the dead ball era had a sports section, and each one had a beat writer and a sports editor. And if there were more than a dozen newspapers, each of these 24 guys, they had their inside scoops. And Lyle and I don't want to just write about, oh, yesterday he got a double and scored twice. We want to get inside their heads and what was going on in the era. And these different sports writers and editors help paint the picture and let us draw on a lot of stuff.
One of the things I enjoy in going through newspapers on microfilm or even digitization, I have a book of, I think it's called Page One. It's a very large book, and it's got newspaper stories, baseball stories that appeared on Page One. They were carried over, so they were very big stories. But you've got everything else that was going on that page. It's
Uh,
like recreate. Reprint of the entire page. So during World War One, you have stories about what's going on overseas and in the country, and that must be a rabbit hole because you see something, oh, let me see more about.
That can be very distracting, and to be very honest, we usually just go to the sports pages, but occasionally, like just last night, I was looking at testimony before the grand jury when John McGraw had to appear after the Black Sox scandal broke up, and those articles were on Indeed page one, even of the New York Times.
Mhm.
But yeah, they can be tempting, and there are so many stories that are out there, and people that have just fallen through the cracks of history and because we just can't comprehend, all of them. They're just too much, too many.
Getting back to Donlin, whenever I see a movie or a book mentioned, that's my rabbit hole. I want to go see, is there a clip of this available anywhere? And most of his stuff is unavailable. I did find that YouTube clip of him preparing a drink for the movie with William Powell. I forget the name of that movie offhand, but it's not a big part. He wasn't a big star, and I don't know if
You know.
later in his life he was famous enough that people would recognize him as a former ball player, but not bad for what he had to do.
No, some people said he wasn't a very good actor. Some more modern writers, but really he was more than respectable, and he even stayed on the stage. And we have a wonderful little clip in there from a gossip columnist by the name of Ed Sullivan,
Hmm.
decades before he became a TV guy, and really just praising him for a movie, for a play, a drama that he was, I think, with Paul Muni on stage in the early 1930s. So Donlin learned his chops from his wife, who died tragically before her 30th birthday in 1912. And that little clip from the movie One Way Passage, has stayed there. The interesting thing is, in 1915, perhaps one of the first movie ever made just focusing on a ball player, almost like Ronald Reagan's movie with of playing Grover Alexander, was Donlin as himself in a 1915 movie that has not survived. And
Uh,
if you go to imdb.com, the movie database, he's credited with about 50 movies. We feel he probably has about 100 because many others haven't survived. And most of them, it wasn't like that 1915 movie. He became a beloved guy in the backlots of Hollywood. And directors, whether famous directors, some and not so famous, great directors, not so great, they try to find a little role for him
huh.
and he would appear in a movie. And that one in particular, and you can still find it online if you Google Mike Donlin One Way Passage. That one he was on the screen for about 60 seconds making a drink for William Powell that Powell proceeded to spill on the woman that Kay Francis, I think. So
And he transitioned from the silent film era to the talkie era. So, even professional actors couldn't do that.
yeah, a lot of them could not. He played a gangster in many times. He played a bad guy, and then he had a sort of another life where he became the baseball consultant for movies.
Mhm.
So if you were make a director making a movie, you want to make sure that baseball fans wouldn't say, "Oh, this is obviously fake." Donlin would be there, and one of the reasons I don't even know if we mentioned in the book why Damon Runyon sat down with Donlin in 26 or 1927. I think it was 26 during the World Series, the Yankees and the Cardinals was the movie Slide Kelly's Slide was being made. And I think maybe Runyon ran into him in St. Louis, and Donlin was the consultant on that movie. And that's when Runyon reconnected with him.
That's interesting. I mean, nowadays consultants, especially in baseball movies, are, like professional ball players as well. But it's hard to think that even way back then they were actually using consultants. Good for them.
Yeah.
You mentioned your next book. Is that something you can talk about or not yet?
Yeah, Lyle and I are actually writing a book about a team that's been very much overlooked. And some people have said, why would you even write about that team? They didn't win the pennant. The pennant race at the end wasn't very close. And it is one of the most colorful and corrupt teams of all time, the 1919 New York Giants. John McGraw signed Hal Chase to that team. He was desperate to win a pennant. Heine Zimmerman, three members of that team were recently pardoned by Rob Manfred, baseball's commissioner, including Phil Douglas, the talented alcoholic pitcher, Benny Kauf. It's a very colorful group of characters, some real misfits and some really good guys. But that 1919 season, McGraw he overreached. He thought he could control Hal Chase, who was known as one of, if not the most corrupt player of all time. and ultimately it didn't work out. And the Cincinnati Reds came from nowhere to win the pennant and the World Series.
As you say, every player has a unique story to tell, and even teams have unique stories to tell that you wouldn't otherwise think about. I'm spoiled living in a market that is very large and has a lot constantly to offer. And sometimes I think of, well, what's the newspaper for the Kansas City Royals writing about? And it's not a
Uh,
big market area. I don't know, do they have the drama that we have, except we don't hear about it because we're New York and they're Kansas.
Well, or when you travel outside of the United States, you get a whole different perspective. My last time when I was traveling in Asia, I was sharing on a bus ride sitting next to a guy from Serbia, and he was telling me about the civil war that's about to break out there. And he said, "I imagine you're aware of it." I said, "I haven't even heard about it.
Wow.
Serbia doesn't make the news here. We're very whatever, U.S. centric
Yeah.
in our focus."
Yeah. Well, we have been talking with Steve Steinberg, author of Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York Baseball Idol to stage and screen. I screwed up the title again. My apologies again. Steve, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Best of luck in the book and enjoy your trip.
Okay, thank you, and appreciate you having me on.